So yeah, I think a couple points of order. VBAT's just posted the HackMD agenda in Slack. I think although the Zoom chat is there, we were thinking it'd make more sense to use Slack because there's more permanence there for chatting throughout the day. It won't disappear when we leave. Sorry, I'm figuring out where my browser window went. So yeah, there are a couple breaks in the day, and then a fairly long. There's a 90-minute lunch break. So those of us in the room will kind of disappear because here at the conference site we can't have food or drink in this room. So we'll have to leave so we can not fall over with dehydration or anything. And yeah, so, I think it's a fairly full day as far as, the agenda filling out our 9 to 5 time, except for that last half hour. So I don't know if there's a way to fit in things that aren't on the schedule, but I think we'll just take it as it goes throughout the day. And see what we can accomplish. What else? Any other points of order that we need to figure out? This setup is, I don't know what it looks like on your end, but for us, it's pretty nice. We can see kind of the gallery view on a large screen to our right, and then we can pin, if people are sharing, we have another screen where we can have the presentation. Your audio comes through the whole room. So hopefully if you're not here, you'll have plenty of chance to be involved in the discussion. Oh yeah, Steve's trying to give you a view of what we see if you look at his video on Zoom. So I don't think there'll be a two-level discussion here in the room versus not in the room. So, but if anyone feels like we're missing your hand raise or attempt to speak, hop in Slack. We'll try and all be aware and watching. But yeah, I think that's kind of all the points of order. Is there anything we didn't get on the schedule that people expected? I know we listed a lot of potential topics, but again, I think given the schedule flow, I think we're basically full. But if it turns out there's an empty spot or something that needs to be shuffled, like let's we're not like 100 people. Let's make it useful for the people that showed up. So yeah, and we're 15 minutes early, unless someone wants me to give a big rah-rah speech about OCI. But that gives us an extra 15 minutes if I stop talking now.
Or just open discussion. I think that was part of.
Yeah, grab your mic. They're just on. They're fixed on.
Oh, okay. So I think it's just, open discussion. I mean, we try to make it as flexible as possible. There's literally, if somebody had something, put it on the agenda, and if there was interest, vote on it was the only thing. So we took a couple of them that we knew people were interested in and didn't hear from others. So if anybody, we got 15 minutes for open discussion, I guess, if people want to start there.
Sure. That's a huge coffee mug, Mike. That's nice. It's like 3 feet tall on the screen, so.
French press with cocoa and sugar.
Wow, nice.
I need at least 4 cups in the morning to get going.
But it's also like 10 o'clock for you. Or 11.
No, it's 11.
It's 11:15. Yeah, but I've been on calls for hours. So
true. Living in one time zone does not prohibit other time zones from communicating. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, Asia Pacific is extremely excited about confidential computing, apparently. So it's keeping me busy. I guess one of the things we can cover, or I wasn't really able to get any of the runtime, engine folks involved in this. Sorry about that. But I think one thing that's important to recognize is that they are starting on a quarterly release cycle. So I'm sure maybe not everybody is aware of that. And if you've got some fixes or changes that you need to see in run C, you got to get it in that cycle now. Similarly to how we do Kubernetes today.
Great.
I'm wondering if for each of the sections, do we want to keep something in HackMD for the action takeaway? So
Yeah.
like versus
Definitely.
just talking about it, for an hour and then moving on. Like was kind of hoping that today would be a way for us to find a
Yeah.
direction for certain things.
Did we get, I know Sargon set up one specifically for his. Did we set up one, or do we just want to use the normal OCI weekly one and you can yank it and put it in OCI afterwards? Like an OCI repo later?
Yeah, in fact, maybe it's just since we all have the today's agenda open, let's just add a notes section there, because I mean it's all markdown, so it's easy to move around later if we need to. So
Is there a template in there for today? Yeah, I'll put let me copy paste the template in there for the bottom.
sure, yeah. So we'll
So 8 people doing it at the same time.
yeah, but maybe it'd be good for someone to kind of sign up for that on each one and be a different person, so someone's not a permanent note taker. So yeah, that's a great idea. So some notes and actions for each of those. And if there's going to be, Jason, I don't know if you have like presentation, but we can just use screen share on Zoom, and we're able to pin it on one of our screens so we can see it in here, and then everyone obviously who's on Zoom should see it. And then if it's shareable, like add a link to it in the HackMD.
All right, the template's there.
Cool.
I'm also happy to start early if we have nothing to fill the time until 12:30 or whatever time it is there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think,
Okay. Let me do that.
Yeah, if there's nothing else to chat about, let's definitely get started. Who wants to do notes on Jason's? Anybody local or remote?
Also, if somebody could let me know if they see that, that would be helpful.
Yeah, yep, we've
Okay.
got it here. Yep.
Cool.
Visible remotely.
All right. All right, I guess I'll start.
Yep.
Whoever wants to take notes or action items or whatever can do so. The session, this is mainly a discussion session. I made a few slides to just sort of level set and get everybody on the same page and to pontificate for a little bit, but the intention is to have a discussion about all of this and not to just watch my slides. So I'll get through these as fast as possible. Who's this guy? I'm Jason H. I'm literally at I'm Jason H basically everywhere, Twitter, GitHub, everything. I live in Brooklyn. Come and say hi. We'll have a pizza. I work at Red Hat on developer tools. I was formerly at Google on Google Cloud Build and Google Code. And to give you an idea how long I've been at Google, I was on Google Reader for a while. At Google and now at Red Hat, I worked on Tecton and OpenShift pipelines and Shipwright and various other tools to build and do stuff with containers. And I'm on the Continuous Delivery Foundation governing board and TOC. I'm a relative OCI noob. I've mainly got years of experience using and abusing containers from the outside and not a lot of experience making changes to them on the inside, but I'm excited to join the new kids, the cool kids table, and see what we can do to these various foundational specs. Again, you probably won't need this. This is a quick history lesson about image spec. Image spec, as we all know, defines how to describe a container image, a runnable thing, and an image index, which is a group of runnable things, and a layout format for expressing those things on disk. These are JSON documents with content addressable pointers to other things, giving you Merkle DAGs, which is like a superpower in computers. Image spec is not alone in the world. Runtime spec depends on image spec. Distribution spec runs on image, or depends on image spec. And so it's sort of at the core of this three-way Mexican standoff, or N-way, if there are other things that depend on these things. Distribution spec moves around images as described by image spec, and runtime spec knows what to do with them when you have them. It knows how to make practical use of an image by running it. And that has all basically worked. Client and registry implementations have blossomed. An entire ecosystem and industry has built up around containers using these APIs. All of us here represent many competing vendors working together for the benefit of our users, and we are all, I assume, gainfully employed. Nice work, everyone. Thumbs up. Everything's fine. And so in July 2017, image spec v1.0, and then minor edits in November of that year, and everything has been pretty good. But since releasing 4+ years ago, not a lot of movement has happened to image spec, especially recently. Some minor clarifications and improvements from about April to about August. I got an annotation approved, or 2 annotations. That was pretty cool. For some reason, all changes to image spec happen on a Monday. I did not realize this. What is it about Mondays that makes people want to update image spec? And some people would say this is working as intended, right? This isn't intended to be any sort of disparagement to the spec or to the group here that's working on it. Nobody wants a platform that's constantly shifting and breaking. Nobody wants something that changes and makes 1,000 breaking changes a month. And that's why we have this group in the first place, is to make sure that we make slow, steady changes responsibly. But it can also kind of look like this, or for a little tamer example, also from Frozen 2. Fun story, I took this screenshot on a YouTube clip, and my daughter in the other room heard Frozen was on and was like, oh, I want to watch Frozen. So then we had to watch Frozen. And it can also look like this, like Tron, who fights for the users. Like I said, users just want stability over all else. They just want to build and run their software and engage in commerce, and want us to get out of the way and not break their things. Lack of change can entirely be working as intended. But stability is one feature of many competing features, including speed and security and cost and compatibility. And as in all software, they all interact with each other. To make something faster means a little less stable, or to make it more secure means it's a little more costly, and you can't have all of them at once. But reports of image spec being frozen are greatly exaggerated. This is a comment on the issue, is image spec frozen? And basically, I don't think this is like authoritative, but I like the way it was said. Backward compatible changes can be made without changing the major version number. And we want to avoid bumping the major version number as much as possible to avoid Python 2.3 madness. And in fact, the image spec is designed for extensibility. In the spec, it says implementations that are reading or processing manifests must not generate an error if they encounter an unknown property. So this is the superpower that gives the spec the ability to add new fields without breaking compliant implementations. In practice, it turns out sometimes that's not always the case, but ideally, and I think we can gloss over the cases where it's not, ideally we can add new fields. We have the ability to add new fields without breaking compliant registries. Here's a set of kinds of changes we could make if we were interested in them. I want to talk more about all of these and specific examples of them, but we can add new annotations. We did it recently, reserved predefined annotations. We can accept new media types. The OCI v2 doc and this afternoon's talk about other file system representations specifically goes into that for how best to more efficiently and quickly and cheaply represent file system representations better than tar. But in practice, these would require client or runtime support to actually benefit from it. If images can talk about some new exotic file system format, but the runtime can't make sense of it to run it, and distribution shouldn't really care, but if distribution did care, then it would need to update to that. We can define new fields, like I said before, see the extensibility section before. These would also might require some client and runtime support to actually benefit from them. If we added the data field that has been proposed to the spec for images, then this has potential downstream effects on distribution and runtime. See before the three-way standoff of things all depending on each other. And we can relax musts in the spec into shoulds or mays. These should be safe changes to make. You can make formerly required fields into optional. You can have other things that aren't layers. You could have other things that aren't config. You can do this, but runtime spec may still depend on some of these fields. If you got rid of it, if you had an image without layers, that image spec considered valid, and runtime spec, what would a runtime do with that if it didn't have layers? And in theory, again, distribution spec shouldn't care, but in practice probably does. In any talk about a V next, we have to talk about compatibility, and that's an important topic because fundamentally users just want to not be broken by our changes. We are Tron fighting for our users, and this whole group is about compatibility. That's why we have these specs, to be able to have compliant implementations of all the specs. And there's a conformance test suite that ensures implementations satisfy the spec, and conformance tests are always incomplete, but I think good to have, or excellent to have, and in a good shape, in particular for OCI. In particular, there's a case where if you relax a must into a may, a registry that, a compliant registry that had expected it to be a must might not assume it can be a may, and so might give you a validation error and say, oh, but you need to have a config, you need to have a layers. And so registries won't adopt this relaxation on day one and may never adopt it. So that's a practical compatibility question that I think we have to wrestle with. Yeah. My proposal is that we think about everything in terms of a v1.1, not a v2, as mentioned before in that doc, or in that comment about v2 can be a lot hairier, and it has the problem of the Python 2 to 3 migration dumpster fire. But a 1.1 can signal, yes, there are changes, and implementations might need to change to support v1.1, but v1.0 will still always exist. This also, I think it would be useful to, my overarching goal in all of this is for us to think about a 1.1 so that 1.2 is easier to think about, so that 1.3 is easier to think about. So we exercise this muscle and get in a better habit about being able to make any change, whether that's for speed or cost or efficiency, or God forbid, if there's some sort of bug, we have to do a release to fix that bug, then we would be happy to have exercised the versioning muscle more recently. Conformance is going to play a big part in this. We need a conformance suite that enforces the 1.1 rules if we have a 1.1, and which means a separate suite. You would need to be able to say this implementation is 1.0 compliant and 1.1 compliant, or only 1.0 compliant. I think we want to make 1.0 the standard, and the gold standard, and say there are no changes to 1.1 that would make you non 1.0 compliant. That's sort of a third rail that we should avoid. In that case, you're effectively going to a V2 where you say, in order to be 1.x compliant, you would not be 1.0 compliant. That's something we should avoid. But I'm happy to talk more about that in more detail. Considerations around this, as before, all of these specs have interdependencies on each other. If image spec goes 1.1, would distribution spec need to have a 1.1 to talk about image spec 1.1 manifests? Would runtime spec have to have a 1.x to talk about being able to run image spec 1.1 things? Would they need to release in lockstep? What is the order of their releases if they're not lockstep? I don't have answers for this. I only have questions, but I'm happy to talk more about people's concerns and thoughts on that. And as always, the practical concerns, we are humans with limited time and energy. Changes are made of people. Changes require people to push them through. And so therefore, changes must demonstrate real value to end users to justify the work. It's not about just improving the spec for our own, love of a well-made API. It's really about, making the world better for users that just want us to get out of the way. And another practical consideration is that we need to have image spec maintainers that are, able to vote on changes and approve changes, whatever they are, or disapprove or reject changes with quorum. We'll talk, I think we have a big session later about OCI artifacts, but I wanted to mention it here. Artifacts, as I see it, artifacts effectively extend the image spec to describe anything. Where image spec describes runnable images, artifacts describe SBOM, signatures, Helm charts, OPA policies, shopping lists, baseball rosters, kind of anything. They are stored and served via the distribution spec. And as far as I know, there's no requirements that, changes to artifacts don't make any changes to runtime spec because runtime doesn't assume artifacts are runnable. There's a lot of good, interesting work going on in ORAS to add the references stuff that I think Steve will probably talk about a little bit later. This is really what we're doing, right? We're swapping out a great golden thing for, well, I don't want to describe V1.1 as a bag of sand, but we have to be careful to swap out the thing we have with something of equal or greater value without causing that huge boulder to come down. And so we really have to be careful. And yeah, I just want to have, I want to kick off a conversation about it. I saw this on the wall of my daughter's kindergarten class, and I thought it was like fantastic. And so I found it on the internet. But like, where are you on these steps? Are you at, I won't do it, I can't do it? Are you at, I can do it, I will do it? I think it's useful to me to think when I'm feeling like not doing something where I am on those steps. So with that framing, I'd love to open the floor to discussion and get people's thoughts on either what kinds of changes you would want to see, what kinds of changes you're not excited to see, what you're worried about as representation from distribution implementations or runtime implementations. Yeah, really the floor is open, and I look forward to discussing more. Does anybody have questions, comments, ideas?
Can you hear me? No.
Almost.
That's it.
A little more volume,
Oh,
just a little quiet.
the OS is messing with me.
There you
Hello. Okay. No, yeah, thank you for that. Some of the relaxing musts to shoulds, I think that was always something we kind of tap danced around of, like, whether to even make something a must or how many things can be shoulds or may or whatever is possible in the first place. Because something like that does feel often breaking, or like it just won't ever make its way out, like you said.
Well, it's way easier to relax. It's easier to never have to relax them, right? I remember in some of the discussions around even the base image annotations, it was like, do we want to be prescriptive and require things about the value of this annotation, or do we want to say, we expect it to be this, it should be this, but if you put in your social security number, we can't really stop you. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that shows up, the hesitance to relax things shows up mainly in trying to be careful about relaxing as much as you can when you define a new thing. But I agree, we've never, as far as I know, there has never been a change or a strong proposal to relax a must into a should or a may because of exactly the kind of consideration. But I think once if we sort of open the door to a 1.1, we can reassess that.
I think many of us, it's kind of this is funny logic, but I kind of wish Trevor King was here so that he could pull out the history decks of all the references. But there was a few conversations that we had about this in the past, even as we were approaching a 1.0, of like whether SimVer was even the right approach, because pretty much it effectively wasn't, you know, for a spec, that it should just be largely a constant refinement. Like if we have something, call it a V1, not 1.0.0, but like a V1, that's like the moving target. And that everything after that should likely be something like a feature flag, you know, and possibly even break down a lot of these different fields of like, do you even support this particular vocabulary or otherwise, or enhancement or whatever? Because even to go, like you said, to like a V1.0, even if for itself it can have its own versioning or life cycle, the kind of like implementations that clients do or registries do would end up saying, you know, like I'm supporting, you know, we branch to V1.1 and we add 2 features, and some clients support one of those 2 features but not the other, you know, and they like say, oh, that's an optimization we liked, but we're not going to implement the other one. So where are they? Are they like a V1.0 client with, you know, they'll sprinkle this other thing that they just happen to support? And it starts getting a little wishy-washy, and it became such a meta conversation that I think it exhausted people that were already ready just to be done with 1.0 and stamp it.
Yeah.
Were already like, I can't grapple with that thought just now, and we deferred the conversation. Because there are times when you might want to make certain optimizations that affect something you'd kind of group into V1.1, but may slide in other changes that don't get widely adopted or something, or inherited.
Yeah, I like the idea of, or the general concept of feature flags or optional feature suites, right? Where like if some client or registry or runtime doesn't support some feature, it can advertise that, or at least advertise it by breaking when you try to use it. And then the question becomes, what is the expected or required behavior of clients or runtimes that you know, now they can't push, you know, my new field or whatever. What are they supposed to do? Oh, there's some hands up. I'm sorry.
Oh, so I'm just gonna step back a little, and it looks like the people in the room have questions.
We should probably just do the raise hand thing as well, just get on level. So I think everybody here is on Zoom.
I'm not.
Okay. Raise your, if you don't want to get on, just tell us, I'll raise your hand for you or something, and so we can do that. But why don't we, anybody objections?
Okay.
Nisha, why don't you go?
Okay. So I'd like to pick an example of what it takes to like make changes that may or may not be breaking. So for example, right now you can use annotations for a lot of the work that we would like to do, but it requires some amount of, I guess, hacking, because right now annotations only allow you to do like a, you know, one key and one value at a top level. You can't really put any kind of structured data in the annotations. You can't organize, I suppose, pointers to other things that may be on the registry. with annotations. We would like to do that. It's just going to be like a big old mess. So let me see how I can hack this. One key is one string, and the value corresponding to that key is a string, but actually you have to we'll probably do something in the back end that interprets it as a JSON blob of whatever the client tool understands. Okay, so that's not standard, but we would like to standardize it. Is there room in the spec to standardize something like this?
A clarifying question to standardize the practice of putting JSON in annotation values?
No, I mean like actually making that JSON blob as a first-class citizen.
Right, sure. So I don't know if this is an acceptable answer to everyone. One silly hack you could do is that because you should be able to specify new unknown fields, you could make that a field in the resource in the manifest and say, I think for sanity, you could do org.nisha.something /name, and then you could stuff a JSON object in there, and registries should ignore it. But I don't know if that's an awful, awful sin according to people who are listening to me. Also,
well, so all of these are awful, awful sins, right? Because they're not specified in the spec. So that's the problem. If the spec doesn't change, people will commit sins.
Well, it defines sin, right? The additional fields are supported. You're not supposed to throw an error, and the annotations can also be used. They're supposed to be supported, and they don't throw errors. It's really the process that you're looking for. If you want it, this to be a first-class field in a manifest that's supported by OCI in general, then we probably need a 0.1 or a new manifest type.
So the reason why we would want these to be a first-class citizen is so that the way that the process is adopted by folks who are registry providers, folks who are using the runtime spec. I mean, that's why we do this. If you were to allow for someone who can say, well, this is like the bare minimum of what we would like something to do, I'm just going to say, oh yeah, this is OCI conformant, but we will layer things on top of it and make our own, tools and ecosystem. And by the way, we will make our own fancy spec as well. Is that something you want to happen? Are you okay with that?
That brings up an interesting question, Phil, Vince. I think there's been a lot of consternation or difficulty around the concept of OCI waiting for APIs to stabilize before we bring that API in, that spec in, that new manifest type in. But yet they're expecting us to be the experts and help them define that. So I think that that OCI. We don't really want to be the front runner on these things. We don't want to lead and force. I think that seems to be coming up quite often. I like Vince's idea of doing extension features and optional testing type features to be a way to resolve that sort of thing. But I think that's where this is coming from.
Can I suggest bubbling up just a little bit, because I think Jason kind of had a core question of the types of changes. And I think if you can categorize those, then it makes it easier to understand when you could use which. Annotations is interesting and also complicated. Annotations is a thing that you can just add. I can just add the Steve annotation, and I probably need to ground it in some unique namespace of some sort, but that's just a known thing. there's no expectations for the registries to do anything with them. Today, most registries don't do anything with them, which I think is a catch-22 problem, that there isn't a standard feature that says, hey, you could index by these and find things by annotations and so forth, and we'd love to see that. But at the end of the day, even if we did support that, the complicated part, the only thing I would suggest there is we should probably put a size constraint on annotations. Otherwise, you can stick a 5 megabyte blob in there, and the thing's supposed to index it, and how are we creating, an index DB kind of thing. My point is that there's this category of things that if we polished the experience around it to scope it, then yeah, you can just use annotations. And maybe Jason uses his annotation for a while until it's proved as everybody loves it. So let's promote it as an OCI standard. So that's just one category of things that can live completely in the image spec, as an example.
I think the only difficulty with that one is taking a page from the IETF with the X type headers on HTTP handlers, as that was originally intended to be a playground until they said, oh, this is a good header, let's promote it to first class. But by that time, everybody that was using it was already using the X type headers, so they just kept it. And it would never become an OCI. Like, we reserve the use of org open containers prefixes, but we want you to use them. And by the time you're using them, then you're not going to change it.
No, maybe I went a little bit too much detail, or that was enough to frame it as even what I thought was a simple thing could be complex. What I was going to just use as the counter to that, just to kind of frame them, is there's certain things we would like to put in the image spec that have an expectation from the runtime, or the most recent ones we've been talking about, the registry. It's not like it's a problem necessarily for Jason to stick a property, I'm sorry, I'm picking on Jason, Fred, whoever, to stick a property in. It's his session, so I guess I get to pick on him. So if Jason puts a JSON property, not just an annotation, but a property in one of these manifests, as long as he doesn't have some expectation everybody else is going to implement it because it's not part of a spec, then I agree, there's nothing wrong with it. The challenge is we're trying to do some of these things where there is an expectation that the registry would be able to do something with them, and not all of them, but some of them, and that we want it to be a standard. So I think all I'm suggesting is there's probably a categorization of things that we could change. It'd be really good to bucket them, because then I could say, look, I know I can change the car on my radio. Like, that's a thing I can do. Maybe not anymore, but I don't know. There's a certain bucket of things that people can do within a scope. But if your need is to have something across distribution and image spec, here's the method for that. And just trying to create some buckets that if we can work with.
Nate's had his hand up for a while. Nate, do you remember what you wanted to say?
For the most part, yeah. My major concern about having a feature flag is the complete mess that happened with OpenGL and IEEE floats, where, it's just complete chaos as to what's implemented. I fully support having, experimental stuff, but I want some kind of baseline, which I like the SimVer for. If you're at version 1.3, you will have these features, period. Otherwise, you're non-compliant. And then have, whole test space. But I really don't want to get into some scenario where we're expected to do one or two things, or even a user expects one thing to work and it doesn't, or they're combining stuff like that. I want nice baselines and preferably some kind of way to test it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's also an interesting point about, like, I forget in what exact context, but there was a proposal to have a feature discovery API or something in distribution spec where you could say, hey, registry, do you support, feature X? And that always seems dicey to me because it's self-reported by the registry, and their definition of whether they support some feature might mismatch your expectations. So I think, like, one way is to ask the registry or ask a registry what it supports, but you might not be able to trust it. Another way would be to try whatever the feature is, push the field, ask for this endpoint, and if it fails, then that means you have discovered it doesn't support the feature or it doesn't support the behavior you were expecting. I don't have specific experience with OpenGL and whether that was tried in that context and failed, or how the many ways it could fail. But it seems in general better to me to expect clients to discover feature compatibility rather than ask for it and get the registry's opinion about whether they support it. Curious what other people think, obviously.
Sorry, which way did you say you preferred?
I prefer, for example, the refers API is a good example. One possibility would, if I want to discover whether the registry supports the refers API, I could ask some endpoint that says, give me all the features you support, right? Like /features would give me a JSON list of feature strings or something. Completely making this up off the top of my head. Don't take this as canon. And if it says, I support references, then I could say, okay, great. I will go hit the refers API because you told me that it works. But if the spec is ambiguous about what it means to support refers, the refers string feature flag, then I might think having that feature enabled means something that is not actually true when I go to that endpoint. Whereas if I go to that endpoint and say, I want to get all references that match this filter because I actually want the filter feature of references, and it says, I don't know about features, or 400 features is not, feature is not enabled or something, then I've learned, like, canonically from the source that isn't supported, as opposed to referencing some list of supported features that may or may not be true based on my reading of those, and then going to the endpoint and saying, do you actually support it? Because now I'm actually asking for it. Does that clarify, or just add words?
I think you're kind of bringing up, is there a bucket for this, for a capabilities API? And I worked on some of the phone platforms, and that works pretty well for phone devices. Obviously that's different, and I'm sure there's lots of failures on things and some successes. But I think without going into how do you design it, I agree. I think there is a question that I'd love to see some capabilities APIs that says a registry supports foo, and it's probably more than true and false. It might be, hey, I already support feature X in version 1. I support feature X with this capability. And
right.
And then hopefully, well, I'm going to design it. Hopefully the client can cache that information so that it doesn't have to ask it every time it makes an API request. But that's probably getting into details.
Right. My position is specifically that I don't want a capabilities API because it can be unreliable, versus the ground truth of trying some endpoint and seeing if it succeeds or fails, or what kind of error it responds with.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is even on Nate's topic anymore, and Josh still has his hand up, so I'm also happy to drop it and come back to it later. Nate, is that helpful at all, or just sidetracking?
A little bit sidetracking. I just want solid baselines, because those of us who are working on compatibility, I just want to be able to work towards it'll comply to this and everything else is optional.
Mm-hmm.
I'm totally for having features that are optional, but it has to be able to work without them.
Yeah, I think in that case, the spec we have today is the baseline, right? Any new feature we add would be optional according to 1.0, and practically speaking would probably only be a should in 1.1. But I don't know. We probably need a specific example of something we want to add before we talk about specific example implementations. Josh, your hand has also been up forever.
Yeah, it's so related to, like, how do we know what the registry supports, or how do we know what's supported? I keep thinking about your slide with the Steve Carell and they're pointing guns, and like, I'm curious what you think it means for image spec to be compliant. Is it how it plays with the registry and how it plays with the runtime? Can it be tested in isolation? The reason I say that is I'm wondering, like, from a practical standpoint, is there a way that we could make the distribution conformance stuff a little bit more extensible, where right now, like, there was a big effort to try to decouple distribution from image, but it's kind of like a joke because in the conformance we're pulling in the image spec Go libraries and forming an image and pushing blobs. I'm wondering if like there's something we can do with that code to make the way that you build an image or an artifact or something more pluggable, so that someone can come in with a new capability with like a JSON file or a YAML file and be like, this is the way this is supposed to look, or like a template or something, and run it against the same test to see if it works with the registry. And then if we could have something on the runtime side that is similar, then you could not wait on the spec to tell you this new feature. Be like, I have this file that defines a new feature. Whoever wants to play with it can run it against the conformance suite with this enabled. And then from like the organization side, like OCI can start to, put together some sort of matrix of these registries or these providers support these different like experimental or vNext features.
Yeah, actually, I noticed the issue you're talking about where the distribution conformance tests rely specifically on image clients and structs. Back when I was hacking on that thing to tell whether a registry supported the data field, I wanted to just make that a conformance test. I just want to say, like, not even like the data field specifically, but can I push a manifest that has XYZ as a field that you shouldn't know about, but you shouldn't fail if I push it to you. That problem was a specific problem in writing that conformance test, because all the conformance tests are phrased in terms of like, given a valid image object with these 5 known fields, what do I do? Well, you can't then test like, what do you do in the presence of an unknown 6th field or something like that. So yeah, I definitely think there's an opportunity for improving the conformance test for that case, and which would start to weaken the dependency on image spec objects specifically. And then from there, we can build on that to say, like, are registries conformant that accept this field or ignore this field that it should ignore? And then
feel like there's any way to test a new version of image spec in complete isolation? Like, does it mean anything to do that?
Is the question, is it possible to test like a conformance? Is there a conformance test suite possible for image spec in isolation that doesn't take into account?
Nothing to do with runtime or registry.
Right.
I'm trying to understand.
In theory, it is, right? Like, but it would basically be: does this JSON document have a layers field? Does it have a config field? Does it have manifest version 2? It's not practically that useful to hold a JSON document describing an image if you can't move it or run it. Like, we're back to the 3-way tango thing. But I think like what we're talking about is sort of making it useful to test an image in isolation, or making it extending the abilities of the conformance test suite to understand that unknown fields should be ignored. That's a weird sentence. So that we put up walls where we know there should be walls, so we can make progress on other features.
I had almost a different basic question. How would, if the distribution spec did go to 2, vNext, whatever, 1.1, how do you know? You can't even ask the registry necessarily what version it is, any more than you can look at an image spec, an image manifest to know, because the media type that says the version is not in the document. This was one of the ones that I was struggling with taking the media type out of the manifest definition. Was you can't look at the document and know what it is. Like,
right.
You have to guess at the schema, and if, picking on JSON again, if JSON happens to stick some properties in that we wind up putting in, I'm sorry, we'll call it 1.1. If we call it 2, I'm not trying to imply major or minor. I'm just trying to do it
Yeah.
next. If the image spec is 2 and we promoted Jason's property to it, how do we know that that's really 2 and this other property that should also be part of 2 is in it? So I think it's not just the capabilities API. I don't know, how do we know how the version is synced across the different specs as you interact with them?
Yeah. Brandon, did you raise your hand to answer that question, or?
Yeah, I'm
That's gonna
looking at that saying, I think you come at this from two different directions. One is from, if you're writing the client, you want to query the registry and see, does that interface give you a 404, or does it come back and actually give you a proper response? And I think you don't care about what version the registry is at that point. You just want to know, does your feature work, because you're trying to send a signature or something like that up to the registry and just need to know if the reference type is there. The flip side is from the users. And the users are looking at, I need a registry service in a cloud somewhere. And it would be nice if those different vendors out there said, we support registry 1.1, and then they just know, okay, it's going to support all these features. I don't have to go through and test each one of those or look through some long fact sheet about what the registry is. They just see it's 1.1, I can move on. OCI gave that stamp of approval and said it's going to have that. And the conformance test should just give them that stamp of approval. Conformance test should say you're conformant up to 1.x.
Yeah, good. That would have been my answer too. Does anybody have any more looming questions, concerns, problems with the general idea of a 1.1, or I don't know. It seems very scary to me, so I happily welcome any feedback on your concerns.
And I think it goes back to the questions, how do you know? It's like, we shouldn't just have to read docs, because even a 1.0 spec, we've argued in the conformance tests, what's required, what's optional, is push, pull, authenticate, discover. So it's really, you can't just say you're 1.0 compatible and you support X. And we'll use the favorite debated topic that we know it goes back and forth between image spec and distribution, is the references API. It's not as simple to just stick a property in the image spec that you expect a registry to implement the ability to get the data back out. How do we communicate expectations back and forth? Should I have to ping the referrers API just to push a manifest that has a referrers property, but it didn't, but the registry is supposed to ignore that property if it doesn't know anything about it. But how do I know that if I'm pushing it, I could actually get the data back out?
Yeah,
Vincent,
Vincent.
an example. I'm sure there's a dozen others that aren't so controversial, but that's the root of a lot of the conversations we're trying to have. What's the structure?
I think it's an excellent example change, right? It's an excellent example change of, yeah, sure, you can push a manifest with references today to any compliant registry. I haven't tried it, but I assume it'll work. But that's not really what you want to do with those. You want to be able to get the index and do the refers thing, right? So that's what you're talking about, is not can a registry accept my references, but will a registry do something useful with them when I give them to them, right?
Right, and not just can I get them back out, but is it going to get garbage collected in that fun conversation?
Yeah. Vincent, I think you were the next person with your hand up.
So a couple of, besides a couple of the actionable steps here, like having, we might even have a v1.1 milestone target or whatever, and like actually spinning the wheels of saying like, what would be in here? That's a fine actionable target. The two things that I hear shaking out of some of this, which is good, and I think but just to call them out specifically.
We lost the
last.
I'm losing you,
Vincent.
I think the things that the distribution spec relies upon that are defined in the image spec need to be teased out. everybody just froze when we can.
We hear blurted pieces from you, Vincent. And I'm assuming you're not just sitting there with your hands on your head still.
I can go next if anyone wants.
Yeah, we should come back to Vincent though, but
Okay. Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll come back to Vincent once he's back. I didn't, I actually didn't catch the reasoning behind why folks do not want like a capabilities or feature API. I would think that you could implement a core like must-have features, and that would address Nate's baseline needs.
I think I think I was the person who came out most strongly against the capabilities API. So I will try to answer this. It unless there is a conformance test suite holding you honest, like unless something says you advertise that you support the, for example, references API in your capabilities API requests, you said you support this, which means I'm going to run the battery of tests that prove that you do that, and that those results are public somewhere, and that my registry like links to my conformance test suite run that says that not only do I advertise that I support that, but I do actually support it. I think unless something is holding me honest, there's a lot of room for me to say that I fulfill this API, and not even like maliciously lying about it, but just like my read of the spec is inconsistent with someone else's read of the spec. And so I think that I support the references API, but I don't actually based on your expectations. So I think it all actually goes back to conformance. The capabilities API isn't necessarily something I don't like, but I don't like it in a vacuum without some conformance, something to keep me honest about it. Does that?
You want it more than user stars approve. Like if registry foo claims it supports some feature and it advertises it in their docs and it reports it on their capabilities API, one aspect is that registry gets a lot of upset users, and because it's not compliant with the spec. That's a cheap way to do it in one sense. We've seen the expense it takes to get conformance tests, although maybe having the baseline bed that you have, it's easy to add new conformance tests too. So I'm not objective to a conformance test. If you're going to write the code to implement some feature and add it to a capabilities API, which we haven't designed yet, let's assume we can get one, then filling in a conformance test doesn't seem like a high bar.
Yeah.
I'd just like to follow up on what I was saying earlier too. Like if you could run the suite and point to some directory with a custom image layout and somehow map that to what's being uploaded, and I put that in Slack too. I think it'd make it easier to test a new feature. Go ahead, Jason.
I forget what I was going to say, and that sounded good anyway. Vincent, are you back?
Maybe. Let's see. I'm now dialed in from two computers, and I'm trying to figure out which one actually works.
That's promising.
Where was I in my thought? I'm sorry. Zoom is distracting me today. Actionable next steps. I think the things that I'm hearing are, if we could disentangle the pieces of distribution spec and image spec that are overlapped would be a huge thing. Because it's come up a few times, and I know for the sake of history, like the reason there's some stuff that was in image spec that should have been in distribution spec was just because the conversation was pushed so long and so far that it took us a long time to get to having distribution spec as a thing. Therefore, some stuff evolved in image spec that really should have then in distribution spec later, and it's messy. That needs to happen. The conversation about like opening a milestone for a V1.1, it might even be out there. It's fine. We can do that. Like the conversation I think is about ready for it. And obviously V1.0.z is calm and cool and collected and whatever. And if there's any departure from that, that's fine. But like you were talking about of like relaxing musts and shoulds, or having a baseline of, you know, at least supporting this, but everything else is optional, or what would it mean even as the implications for a V1.1, to have some kind of rubric of like saying, hey, here's the thing that I'd like to see this in a V1.1, or, you know, even a V1.0, and saying, well, does it implement a new must? Does it, you know, like whatever kind of, like, what are the implications of it? And at least having a small stanza to say, cool, does it do these things? Does it, you know, do or not do this small rubric of things? Maybe rubric's not the right word, but still to say, cool, this is not breaking. And ideally, yeah, it'd be even better if that was a conformance test. I feel like we tried and that got abandoned on just the image spec and kind of runtime spec. Like, if we can push for that, that'd be great. Build it into GitHub Actions. I don't care. Like, super. But at least being, you know, having enough of this discussion, and it's kind of circled around that. Obviously, we're having a hard time finding the right words for it. But if saying this is or isn't breaking, or at least have a human eyeball and say, I think the implications of this are cool. That would really help, because right now some of those things are so subjective that it leads to lengthy discussion that I think exhausts a lot of people, and circles back to your other point of like, we're all like kind of like doing our best on this. And if a discussion gets circular or tiresome, consider it dead in the water. And anything that leads to conversation not getting circular or tiresome is the best. That was my point.
Totally agree.
I want to just angle in on the topic. What is the definition of versioning? What is the definition of what breaks and what's not? We've had endless debates just on that topic. So I think we have to go write that down so we can agree on that.
I agree. I think that would help it not be a circular death spiral conversation. Brandon, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, I was going to go back to one of the comments Steve made earlier of how do you detect some of these things, like the reference types. We'll keep using that as the common example we pick on. And this direction I'll go with that is that should be part of that extension, whatever they're doing for their spec, is they should include that in part of their definition of what they add for the API of how they can use this properly within their stuff, so they don't have to go out to some external system to check a version number or something like that. And so that's just direction I'll go, is just make that part of whatever you're adding. Is you need to be able to query it to see if you can use it.
How do you know that? Like, that is a good example of one that it's multiple pieces, regardless of what manifest spec it's in. Let's just ignore that for the second. A client can submit up a document, a manifest, that says I'm pointing at something else. I'm referring to something else. I'm ignoring even the property. That's part one. Part two is I can get it out and it's indexed. There's some life cycle question, but probably the fact if you support those two things, the spec says that this is the behavior. But the problem is it's not as simple of, like, should I have to be able to say, does the manifest get accepted? And if it does, well, if it's only a property, an additional property in the existing manifest, by definition, it will get accepted. Doesn't mean it's supporting it. So for every put, do I have to query the referrers API to see if it exists? I mean,
I think
what I'm saying is
in
that some of these
advance,
properties are more complex.
I think in advance, if you're concerned about that, I think the answer is yes. You have to have something you can hit. Maybe it's refers API, maybe it's something that goes along with the refers API, but something you can query to know, is this going to be useful down the road? Or you can say you just don't care about that and you're going to throw it up there, and if it works, it works.
Yeah. Michael has also had his hand up, and I want to make sure we get to his thing if he has a thing. Oh, there. Thank you.
Hey, yeah, I was curious, like we do have versions in, I think the API paths, and then there are at least major versions on media types. Like when you think of the next minor version, do you imagine that those minor versions would show up in API paths and or media type names? And is that a way that we could allow registries and clients to either accept or deny content?
I think those types of things are tools in the toolbox, and I think they're heavily dependent on what kind of change we're talking about to be able to know whether they make sense to use them. Like if I'm pushing some new layer type and it's not a tar file, it's a .txt file or something. Or some new version of tar. They've come out with tar version 2.0 or something. That is a place where I would want to be able to say, this is a tar, gzip tar v2 format like thing. I don't think, I think that those are other like affordances we have available to us, whether paths in registry URLs or versions in media types. Those are tools we have available to us. I think they can be useful depending on what type of change we want to use them for. I think it would be useful to write down all of the places we have these affordances, right? All of the places we could make changes. And then when we are evaluating a change we want to make, we could say, oh, all we need to do is like abuse this, the semantic information embedded in this path to turn that on or off or whatever. Some of them will be more useful, more broadly useful, and some of them will be less, but those are two I haven't thought of so far. So I think writing those down is helpful.
Cool. And then like with what Steve and I've been talking about with artifacts is a new manifest type altogether. Is that something that we would expect registries to just accept under the ignore unknown fields? Or does content type, when you push a manifest, are registries allowed to be more restrictive about whether or not they accept a new media type?
I don't know the specifics of what registries, what either the spec says they should or should not allow as far as flexibility or anything. I will say to the point of having a new manifest type, I am sort of the opinion that we shouldn't invent new manifest types unless they solve some like formative foundational versioning issue. It might be, we might be circling around the topic that image spec is not practically versionable because of, prior decisions and many implementations of it. And the only way to get out from under this is to come up with some new manifest. But I don't want to jump into some new manifest type and then find out that we've also made all the same decisions that made it unversionable in practice. Because then we're just setting ourselves up for 4 years from now, coming up with some new manifest, some new manifest, and this time it'll solve it once and for all.
Yeah.
And we've not learned any lessons. So I don't know if that's practically what is being proposed in new manifest types, but I just want to say, if we come up with some new manifest type, I want to make sure that it is not making the same version locking mistakes that we may have made in image spec land.
And I'll just add, like, the new manifest type is not expected that a registry would accept if it doesn't know how to process it. That was one of the reasons. And we are circling around the versioning. That's one of the fundamental reasons why a new manifest was created. But that is also an expectation, is the registry would not blindly accept it, because there's an expectation that if you accept it, there's some indexing happening, there's refers API, there's a schema that's different. There's a bunch of details which we'll talk about later, but I think that was absolutely a big piece of it, of a very expected, we want a registry to opt into this behavior, because there's no way to do this experience in a reasonable way, we believe, that they don't opt in. And and there's runtime components of this also, right? We don't expect the runtime to opt into an encryption model magically. There's got to be something that changes there too. So I think we're, again, just back to the versioning thing. How do we version? How do we check what something, if we do have a versioning model for how do you define it, how do you check an endpoint, whether it's a registry or a client, do you support this version?
Yeah, I think that is a question we will have to answer before being able to, I don't know if we'll answer it here today in the next 10 minutes, but that is an answer we'll have to come up with to practically make changes. I wanted to mention a case where I think it is important that we exercise this muscle of versioning, and that it scares me. A particular example of how it scares me that we haven't exercised the muscle of versioning, which is, let's say SHA-256 gets broken tomorrow. That would be terrible for a million reasons, one of which is OCI falls apart. Because practically speaking, I think the spec says you can use any SHA algorithm, any algorithm you want, but practically speaking, the only one that's ever supported is SHA-256. I think it would be a useful and illustrative example to go through how would you upgrade the spec and distribution and runtime and registry implementations and client implementations to support SHA-257, which, right, it doesn't exist, but the point is it's an example. Like that is not, if that ever happens, it is likely to happen unexpectedly and need an urgent fix. And we are not in a position to unexpectedly make urgent fixes to things.
That's a great thing. And that's the kind of thing that I feel like could have a nice little ribbon put around it for like a working group, like very clear outcome, like go through this example, see what all had to be touched or broken or expectations or future shoulds that should be in place, and like implementation proposals, and then like how would it, what would clients need, like really nice case in point.
I mean, I think like practically every implementation would have to be involved in that, right? Which means it's effectively impossible. But we could go through the practice of what a spec would look like that supports some made up new SHA thing. I know that the Git protocol went through a similar thing with regards to their SHAs, like MD5. Don't use MD5s, yeah, but they always thought, oh, MD5s would be good forever, and then turned out they weren't. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up as a forcing function to think about this and to exercise the muscle, because someday we will have to exercise the muscle, and we will be happy to have exercised it earlier than wait until everything's on fire. Steve, you also have your hand up. I don't know if that is a lingering hand. I will lower mine as well. It disappeared. Was that a lingering hand?
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, okay. No worries. No worries.
I was actually curious. Like I had to think about this more. I would hope, and I'm sure some registries crack the content, but I would hope a registry just says, don't care, just passing it through. It would, all the clients, I think, obviously have to figure it out because they're the ones actually doing something with it. But I was actually just checking. I wasn't even sure about that.
I think it would be to the conformance suite question we had before. I think it would be an illustrative practice to try to push a SHA-512 digest to any practical registry and see what it does. I think it's supposed to verify that SHA matches the blob that you push to it. And if it's a made up hash function that I just made up yesterday, then it won't, because it doesn't know what to do with that. So I think in practice, I think you'll find that it has to be SHA-256 everywhere and nothing else is supported. And that's scary if all of a sudden the thing that everything is built on falls apart. Granted, if SHA-256 is broken, millions of other things are on fire. So maybe OCI isn't our highest concern, but I think it's an illustrative example of someday when we might have to make a change urgently without expected, without knowing it's coming. I started a little early, so I'm totally happy to finish a little early too. If people don't have anything else to talk about, I can also keep talking about this if people want to keep talking about it. But have we come up with any sort of interesting action items? I think I will probably take
Phil, you
personal
said,
action item. Go ahead.
Yeah, Phil, you said something about actionable items in Slack, and if you could tease that apart, I don't. I can't hear you.
Hey, sorry. Yeah, no, I was just following up on how we started the discussion that I think it was Josh mentioned. I mean, part of the note taking was that we can not just talk all day, but have some follow up. So 20 minutes ago, you had mentioned a few things that sounded like good, next up practical items. So I just wanted to make sure we captured that. And if there was anything else that we should.
I mean, to me, the root of your whole session is what do we do about versioning so we could do anything with these? Like, I don't think anybody wants to freeze any of these specs. We just don't know how the hell to do anything. I mean, the squirting out of what you're seeing we're doing in the artifact stuff is because we couldn't find another path to move forward.
Yeah. I think if we come to the conclusion that image spec is effectively frozen because of, it is practically impossible to make changes because of the interdependencies of everything, then that would be a shame. But I think we can get value out of it by fully understanding how that got to be, so that a new thing without those problems can come into existence, as opposed to a new thing with all the same problems coming into existence. Obviously, I think my priority, my preferred outcome is that image spec is not frozen. We figure out how to unpractically freeze it, figure out versioning, move forward, and exercise the muscle. But as a fallback and plan B, if it's not possible and some new manifest type has to exist, I at least want it not to have the exact same practical versioning impossibilities. Which means like doing a postmortem and understanding how those things came to be in the first place and avoiding them in the future. I just don't want to make the same mistakes over and over. I'm happy making new mistakes. I love making new mistakes. I just don't want to keep making the same old mistakes. With that, I will probably hand it over to whoever's next and go join the Slack to see what you guys have all been talking about.
Yeah, so we have basically a 30-minute break in the schedule at this point. People can hang out on Slack, on Zoom, but
yeah,
some of us in the room will be bio break, water, coffee, whatever.
Cool. Thank you for the opportunity, and thank you for the discussion. It's been good.
Yeah,
Thanks, John.
Yeah, great presentation and
Jason,
good
yeah.
discussion.
Sorry.
Mic issues seem to be fixed, so I don't know that we need to be able to like do a bunch of tests during like break-ish.
Yeah, if there's no more buzz, then
It seems
we're good.
fine.
Steve, no.
I think it was me. I was putting the mic down next to my power supply.
That would do it. That would do it. So don't do that. Cool. All right.
From mistakes, I think we just talked about.
Don't do that. Awesome. We will convene at 11 again, and that'll be the confidential computing group. So.
And it's fine if people want to talk over this time.
Yes.
Yeah, it can be a conversation as long as you hold the mic.
Yeah, I think Vincent, wait, is that the action item out of this? Is we try to figure out how to deal with versioning across these, like categorize them and so forth, including capturing where do we screw up so we don't do it again.
Like you say, you want to exercise the muscle. Do we have?
Oh, and that one.
Do we have the proper exercise tools?
Yeah, Steve, we did take that down as one of the actionable items. If you'll see it in the
the marker that I put in the notes of like wrap up and actionable items is not a concise list of actionable items. That was just like minutes of conversation. So from that, we would draw actionable items. So don't expect that to look cleanly like a list of actionable items.
The SHA 512 is like a great example. Like if somebody.
Yeah, and I think we just got Blake to be approved in some of the Go Digest stuff as well. People are testing that out. So I mean, like people are actually doing this, but it's usually in isolated situations where they know they control the client and registry and the other side that's pulling the image back down. But for a general use case, what would happen if you just pushed it? I think it'd be great to tease that out. I will. Yeah, I'll be right back in just a minute then. I'm going to take a quick break and then I'll chat.
Cool.
So for those here, they moved our coffee, and I think there's some kind of food right out here in the hall. She said.
Are we allowed to drink coffee here? Or do we have to go outside?
No, we're supposed to actually stand out there.
Oh, but we can be out
Yeah,
there.
you can be at these high tops and drink and eat.
This morning it was inside, and it was like, no, it's your last coffee inside.